Well, thank you very much. And I'm very honoured and delighted to be here. This is my second time in 2 years here because the book was shortlisted for an award here, and we had a wonderful night on that occasion, and I know I'm going to enjoy this evening with you, the audience. I first of all want to just briefly cover the demographic changes that are happening with respect to ageing. During the last 200 years, the average human life expectancy has doubled in most of the developed countries, so that we can expect year on year to live longer. In fact, over the last decade, we've increased life expectancy by over 2 years, 2.2 years. So that's what this looks like. Since the 1800s, since accurate records have been kept. Now, this is fantastic. I have to say that it is attenuating slightly up here now, and that's mostly because of changes in socioeconomic conditions in England, particularly in Scotland, and in the US. We can come back to that maybe later on during the discussion. But it is a good news story. It's a great news story. What it translates into, if we have a family, Molly born last year, Connie born this year, they're called Irish twins, so 2 girls in the 1 year. Connie this year is likely to live 3 months longer than Molly born last year. That's what it actually translates into. So this is a fantastic achievement demographically. Now, of course, it translates into changes in our population proportions of older persons, because fertility rates are dropping, family sizes are dropping significantly and have been doing so over this same period of time. And yet life expectancy is increasing. In fact, let's just take a pause for a moment and think about some of the terminology around life expectancy. One of the terms that's used is lifespan, and that equates to the maximum number of years an individual can live, making lifespan unique to every single one of us. Now, for the optimists in the room, the longest lifespan that we know we can live as humans is 122 years and 5 months, because Jean-Louis Calment lived that long. So that's the potential human lifespan. The younger members are much more likely to achieve that, I have to say, than some of the rest of us, just because of that demographic shift I've shown you. Now, life expectancy, this is the terminology that's used most frequently, and that's the average age an individual can expect to live at different stages of life. For example, at 65 now, a 65-year-old female can expect, on average, to live another 21 years, and probably more depending on lifestyle, but on average another 21 years, and a male 18.5 years after 65. Health span, conversely, is what we're most concentrated on in health and social care systems. And that's the number of years someone is healthy without chronic and debilitating disease. Now, this story isn't as optimistic or good news as the others, unfortunately, because there's huge variation. This is in the United Kingdom alone. The difference between health span in Blackpool versus the Orkney Islands from ONS data in 2022. Healthy lifespan in Blackpool is 50, or was then 54 years, versus 75 in the Orkney Islands. I have never visited the Orkney Islands, but it's definitely on my bucket list to try and explore what is so different. But we do know a lot about what's driving the difference in health span globally. And it's deprivation. Look at this data. Again, from ONS, figures between 2018 and 2020. The most deprived 10% of small areas versus the least deprived 10% of small areas. Almost 52 years in good health in the most deprived areas, and 26.4 years in poor health. So not only a shorter life expectancy, but shorter health span also, healthy life expectancy. In the least deprived areas, by contrast, instead of this 52 years, it's almost 71 years in good health, and an extra 15.6 years in poorer health. Now, clearly, what we would all like, and what we're very concentrated on in the clinical research world, is to try and condense those orange bars so that we spend the minimum period of time possible towards the end of life in poor health. And that's some of the clues I'm going to share with you today. Okay. In a clinic, this happened a couple of years ago. I was sitting down and a gentleman came in. He was in his late 60s. He was obese, very high BMI, smoking and drinking and not taking physical activity. Red rag to a bull, you would say. So I sat him down and I tried to give him some, workable advice on lifestyle behaviors. And he said to me, "Oh, don't be worrying yourself, doctor. I'll be grand. My mother lived to 90 and my father to 87. I have nothing to worry about." Was he right? Well, actually, our genes, what he was referring to, are only responsible for 20, at the most 30% of lifespan. The remainder is we have control over. They're environmental factors, lifestyle, behavioral factors. Now, if you make it to 80, the genetic contribution is higher than that. It's about 40%. But generally speaking, it's 20 to 30%. The rest of factors which influence how long we live and our healthy life expectancy, healthy lifespan, are environmental factors. I don't mean climate change, although it does make a difference. I'm talking about a broader family of environmental factors. And we know an awful lot about this from twin studies, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But I'm going to show you a picture of 6 gentlemen, to a degree, all aged approximately 60 at the time of these photographs. They look very, very different. And actually, how you look maps quite closely to your biological aging, your cellular aging, provided you haven't intervened surgically or otherwise, I expect. So, what were the factors during the life course of these men that changed how old they look at around the same chronological age? That's the number of candles on their birthday cakes. The environmental factors. And to understand that better, we go to twin studies. These are identical twin women in their 50s, but they don't actually look like identical twins now, although they are genetically. That means, of course, that they have shared genes, shared environment, born into the same environment, and age and sex in this case. But what they have experienced throughout that 55-year period is different exposures, environmental exposures. Smoking, job loss, income changes and stress associated with that, changes in marital status and the stress associated with that, lifespan adversities generally, occupational hazards, housing quality, and diet. All of those factors actually negatively influence the experience, the biological experience of aging. And we can actually measure, probably one of the better ways, there are a number of different ways of measuring that biological experience, but probably one of the better ways, or certainly one of the most topical ways and rapidly advancing way, is epigenetics. And with epigenetics, what we do is measure sites on the promoter part of a gene, which is what's dictating within the cell the protein production in order to produce energy. So the instructions for the cell to deliver energy. And all we are is trillions of cells that produce energy. That's what we're made up of. That's our purpose. And part of that energy purpose, of course, is reproduction of cells. So we can measure those CPG sites, and the more active and involved the sites are in energy production, the better, the younger the biological aging of the cell. Look at these twins. This is, the yellow here is when the twins were, this is a very heavy pointer, I feel like I'm playing baseball. The three-year-old, when they were three-year-old identical twins, the yellow coloration in their epigenome actually indicates the similarity in their epigenetic markers, in those CPG sites, in those instruction sites on the promoter part of the gene that tell us biological aging of cells. Whereas at the age of 50, green and red now indicate the discrepancy in those epigenetic sites. And you can see there's very little yellow left. There's very little similarity left. This twin actually had experienced a number of adverse life events, but also was a smoker, and also liked the sun, but also particularly was a smoker and had stress in her life and was taking antidepressants at the time of the photographs. So consequently, she looks older, but actually at a genetic level, at an epigenetic level rather, she is biologically older. And this is what is used to measure biological aging, cell aging. So not just the number of candles on a birthday cake, because that's a very fixed figure, and frankly, you know the expression age is but a number. It doesn't mean anything. But what does matter, what does mean something, although we don't actually know the causal direction of what it means yet, is biological aging. And this can be measured now. You can pay to have your biological age measured. This is one of the tests, probably the most popular, and in our research, we would actually promote this particular epigenetic clock test, GrimAge, not an attractive name for a biological aging test, but there you go. GrimAge as being one of the better aging measures, epigenetic aging measures. So $325 you can learn what your biological aging is. I don't know what mine is, because I don't know what to do with the information, frankly. I know what I should be doing. And I also know, and I'm going to share those with you now, the markers that I can modify, I can do something about. And the other thing is we don't know yet if your epigenetic measure, if that measure is actually causing cells to age, or if it's as a consequence, a byproduct of whatever was going on in cells. And, if you modify it, does it matter? Does it make a difference? We don't have sufficient long-term studies to answer that question yet. Because remember, one of the challenges with age-related research and aging research is ultimately you want to know, can you introduce interventions that will extend lifespan? But actually, in truth, that means you're waiting around an awful long time for results of studies. You mightn't be here when that study, that longitudinal study, actually finishes. And there are intermediate markers we can use, but they don't necessarily answer that question. So that's one of the challenges with respect to age-related research. These are the things we can do something about, and these are the things I care about with respect to myself when I'm concentrating, okay, what can I do to modify biomarkers, blood markers that I know about that are that are relevant to aging and that health span and condensing that period of ill health or poorer health at the end of life. Because after all, that's all really we want to know. I've asked this question to audiences before, and the two things that people want most from a good experience of aging are, I want to keep my memory and I want to keep my mobility. And that actually pretty much covers everything. And as a doctor, you know, kidney disease, heart disease, that doesn't matter to the individual. If their mind is good and their mobility is good, then their life experience and functioning is good. That's what matters. So what I'm going to share now next actually influences both memory and mobility. And we looked at a combination of 13 cohort studies. Cohort means groups, large groups of people, usually longitudinally followed. That means same people being followed every 2-3 years. So we looked at over 67,000 people involved in these longitudinal studies, aged 40 to 111. And there were 40 biomarkers, blood measures, that were similar. Not just blood measures, but weight and height, etc. They were similar across those 13 cohort studies. And those biomarkers, those measures, actually related to 12 different physiological systems. What's a physiological system? The brain, the blood pressure, the endocrine system, the kidney system, the gut system, the muscle system, the bone system, etc. So pretty comprehensive overall coverage of what matters in terms of the brain and body. And we found that these were the biomarkers, the blood measures, which actually best predicted functional outcomes. Walking speed, grip strength, which is a great measure for muscle strength, a grip dynamometer, and self-rated health, how you feel your health is. It's a good measure, actually, of how you're actually, what your aging biology is like. If you feel young, and I'll come on to that in a moment, and you feel healthy and you feel well, biologically, pretty much you are. So the measures are cholesterol. We know that particularly HDL cholesterol. Here's my ball back. HDL cholesterol, waist to height ratio, C-reactive protein, an inflammatory marker, resting heart rate, very important, hemoglobin A1C, a marker for diabetes, a blood marker, DHEAS, it's a sex hormone that both men and women have, peak flow rate, that's the amount of air you can quickly blow into a tube, a very simple measure of lung function, a kidney marker, cystatin C, and heart rate variability. But these top ones, were the top 5. So if you've managed your resting heart rate and you don't have diabetes or pre-diabetes through this marker, and your inflammatory marker is low, and you don't have a big waist, basically, and you've managed to keep your good cholesterol, HDL cholesterol up, and all of these are modifiable by changing diet, by changing physical activity, etc., then the future looks good. And then other studies have also looked at outcomes like stroke and heart disease, etc., and shown that very similarly, HDL and LDL cholesterol and blood pressure, midlife blood pressure, is a modifiable risk factor for Alzheimer's disease in later life. Blood pressure is very, very important. When I was a young doctor and we started out with hypertension studies, etc., the target blood pressure was 160 over 100. Now it's 120 over 80. It keeps going down, a bit like cholesterol. The thresholds keep going down. So don't be afraid of a low blood pressure as long as you don't get dizziness or fatigue or weakness from it. It's a good indicator. And of course, there are lots of treatments one can take to manage blood pressure. Again, pre-diabetes markers, very important. BMI, probably not as good as waist height or waist-hip ratio. And basically, that's just about the big belly. And resting heart rate. And these are from other studies that haven't just looked at the functional parameters that we've looked at in our large series, but rather have looked at hard outcomes like stroke and heart disease and death from same. Right. So you bother your GP every year now. I hope, because I actually really believe that we should all know those biomarkers from 40 onwards. And we should be able to actually plot their trajectory, and all of them we can intervene on. And we know they have beneficial outcomes. It's a no-brainer. Right, these are the fun bits. None of that was fun. This is fun. These are the fun bits of how we can influence that biological aging process. Relationships, I can't cover them all, but I'll cover relationships. And I'll cover physical activity. And at all of these junctures, stress, remember, is underpinning an awful lot of these environmental factors, exposures, which influence biological aging. But I'll also talk a little bit about attitudes and purpose. The lady beside me we were talking about ageism earlier on, and I'm really hot on that topic right now. And then things like purpose and diet and creativity and cold water, we'll touch on some of those as we go through. Modifiable factors for biological aging. Relationships. Now, isn't it great that the quality of relationships, not the number of people who follow you on Facebook, but the quality of relationships actually influences biological aging, and it's because of how we've evolved. We've evolved to work in communities. We've evolved to be part of tribes. We've evolved to need each other. We've evolved within a tribe to each have a function within that community. And once that goes, we almost involute. And that's a stress trigger which actually accelerates biological aging. So relationships really matter to us as humans. This is a great... again, it's a meta-analysis, so it's pulling together a number of studies, 148 studies, which looked at the quality of relationships, numbers of relationships, and other exposures or environmental factors, and then their outcome was death from heart disease. So how does the quality of your relationships and the numbers within those high-quality relationships or low quality, as in the case of presenting the data, how does that square up to other well-known risk factors like smoking and high cholesterol, etc.? Well, this is how it squares up. Now remember, this is with death from heart disease or stroke. Overall, obesity is here as a risk factor for mortality, physical inactivity, alcohol, smoking. Complex measures is marital relationships and other near relative relationships. And then overall social relationships is everything, and I'll show you the graph for that. But look at the relative contribution that these relationships are making to cardiovascular mortality compared to traditional risk factors. Isn't that remarkable? And that's through that evolutionary process that I discussed, and stress and inflammation, etc., related to that. Because loneliness and social isolation trigger inflammation. And inflammation is probably, it's the most popular contender at the moment for the biological accelerated aging process. Why cells might more quickly age than others. And that's all linked to stress hormones in both animals and humans. It's the same for both species. And in the book, I talk about, really interesting animal experiments which have looked at this. Say macaque monkeys. If a monkey is isolated from its group, within 48 hours of isolation, the lymph nodes in the monkey's neck, which are the regulators, the determinants of inflammation, they upregulate or downregulate our inflammatory processes. They've upregulated the genes associated with inflammation within 48 hours of isolation. And the pathways that loneliness affect are the stress hormone pathways, cortisols and other stress hormones, or the glucose pathways. That's the pathways involved in diabetes. nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, arguably the most important system in our body, because if it stops, if the autonomic nervous system fails, we cannot continue to survive because we can't breathe and our heart rate is too, our heart can't beat. And inflammation. And you can see here that loneliness can trigger pathways through the adrenal glands and the brain itself, the HPA axis, right down to changes in blood pressure and to inflammation through these nervous system and inflammatory pathways. This is a lovely story of a friend of mine who did what I'm hoping to do in Orkney, a site visit to Sardinia. And she was sitting with an 103-year-old in his kitchen, trying to actually discuss with him through qualitative research what it might have been that contributed to his healthy longevity, because he had hardly any illness, and he was an active man at 103. So she sat down in the kitchen in the morning. There were 3 generations living in the house, coupled with the fact that the kitchen was at the front of the house on a little road, which was the one road down to the port, and everybody who passed popped in to say hello to him. And it was halfway through the morning she thought, my God, this is busier than a railway station. And then it occurred to her, because, the other kids were coming down and talking to him from the kitchen and people were passing. She hardly got a word in edgeways. And she realized that his secret was that his life was full of variety. And he himself was full of curiosity and constant social engagement. He hadn't time to die. And we've shown similarly in the longitudinal study of aging that we run in Ireland, TILDA, which is repeated measures on the same people now for almost 20 years, that actually volunteering and social participation, looking after grandchildren, are associated with a higher quality of life and less depressive symptoms and less disability, less of that poor health at the end of life. And they're all things that we can do something about. We've also taken blood samples and other samples, saliva and feces, and we know that inflammatory markers are much lower in people who have good social engagement, good social activity. And I am now publicly committing to the following, because I heard this recently and I thought, okay, I'm going to do this in September. Super Friendly Friday. One of the problems about getting people around, or this, for me, it's a problem, because I would talk till the cows came home, as they say in Ireland, but I get very nervous if I have to cook a meal for anybody. And that's an inhibitory factor for me. But this is Super Friendly Friday. All you do is you put on a big pot of soup, brown bread, some wine, and you invite people in the neighborhood to pop in for soup. They know it's soup. They have no expectations, and yet the whole purpose is to engage. I loved that concept, so I'm now publicly stating I'm going to do it in September. I hope not too many neighbours come in, hear the podcast. And this is the wider circles I was talking about with respect to loneliness. Don't underestimate how wide your engagement circles are, and they all matter. Obviously, your personal cell is important, and your intimate zones, friends, family, relationships, marital relationships and otherwise, are important, but there are other zones. The guy who you see every day in the shop when you're buying the newspaper, or people you meet when you're walking the dog, or even familiarity of your own locality in terms of shopping or whatever. All of those zones matter, which is why when people, when they reach 65, say, okay, once I've retired, 65, my husband and I, or my wife and I, are going to move to the seaside. We're going to move out of whatever. Our community where we've lived for the last 40 years. And it's not a wise decision, unless you already have a community ready-made there, because you will lose all of this. And it takes time to cultivate. And then the next thing I just wanted, a couple of short things before we end. The girls at the end of the room are agitating for me to stop. Are physical activity. Now, of course, that's a whole big area of itself, but I want to raise 3 issues. First of all, aerobic exercise, we know about that. We know about the frequency, minimum of 150 minutes a week. but we don't actually pay enough of attention as we get older. And when I say older, I'm talking about over 50, to balance. And it's poor balance and poor muscle strength are the commonest reasons for us to fall. And once you fall, once you start to fall, it's a downward slope. 45% of people who fracture a hip never get back to their previous level of independence. It's terrible. So we don't do fractures well as we get older. Much better to prevent them. So balance matters. And so does muscle strength. Muscle mass starts to decline after 30 for the younger members in the room, so you don't feel excluded. and accelerates after 60. So strengthening exercise, resistance exercises are very, very important. So I would recommend strongly a combination of all three at all ages. This is Pamela Anderson. And she did something very brave and fantastic recently. She actually decided that she would no longer wear makeup. And she came out, and you can check it up on Google. I think she looks beautiful now. But she was hammered on social media how old she looks, how much better she looks with makeup, etc., etc. I found that very sad. But also, she was strongly supported by others, including well-known names in Hollywood, for her courage, her bravery, and actually for the kick in the face that she gave those ageist attitudes and inappropriate attitudes. Pride to be who you are at every stage in life. So good for her. Because our work has shown very much so that if you have a negative perception of yourself, if you feel uncomfortable about your age, if you feel that others are making you uncomfortable or are viewing you differently, or as some older women said to me in a session recently, we feel we have become invisible. That's terrible. If you feel that, our research has shown in TILDA that those negative perceptions actually accelerate biological aging because they're stressors to the system and they're stressors to inflammation. Consequently, we have to work very hard to obfuscate ageism in society, ageism in the media. And it took very little during COVID for the thin veneer that covers ageism to be unmasked. All of a sudden, in many Western countries, if you were 70, you were strongly advised, to the point where some people thought it was mandatory, not to go out. And what was the implication there? What was the message? The message was, you're 70, you're no longer of any value to society. So I think we have to be very careful, very loud in our response to ageism, but also there's strength in numbers, and the demographic changes that I showed you earlier on, and the higher proportionate numbers of people who are getting older in our society will enable us to do something about all of that. And this is lovely work from Becky Levi's group in Yale, which experiments that she's run to show that even in younger folk, we can influence stress and inflammation through perceptions. 2 halves of a class of psychology students, 1 half were given these positive stereotypes after measuring their autonomic system and blood markers for stress and inflammation. And the other half of the class were given these negative stereotypes: Alzheimer's, confused, declined, decrepit, dementia, dependent, dying, forgets, incompetent, compared to accomplished, advised, astute, creative, enlightened, etc. Then they were both given a mathematical stress test. And the stress markers were remeasured, hormones and autonomic nervous system. And the positive stereotype exposed students, this half of the class, actually had much lower information and lower stress markers than the half of the class who had been exposed to negative stereotypes. So language matters. Now, where I come from in the west of Ireland, I know this is cold water immersion, very topical now, very, very good for autonomic health, heart, dopamine, serotonin, feel-good hormones, etc. There's a lot of work on it. But where I come from, we called it swimming. So it's been glamorized latterly. And of course, it's not possible, maybe, for some of us living, or some of you living in London or inland, etc. But this is almost as good. You don't clearly get the same social interactions, well, for most anyway, as you will here. Maybe I'm too old-fashioned, but generally speaking, this also has a lot, cold water swimming or swimming has a lot of social engagement and exercise, etc., which this doesn't do. But it still has the same neurohumoral benefits. So think about cold water immersion or showering if you can. And also, saunas have been shown to have great benefit now with respect to aging, reducing or influencing dementia. Augmenting physical activity, reducing stroke, and this is in Finnish longitudinal population studies where people have been exposed pretty much, for many years, 2 to 3 times a year to sauna, and often sauna alternating with cold water exposure, hypertension, pain, lung disease, better sleep, etc. So, if you don't feel like exercising, just go down to the sauna instead in the gym. It will have some positive benefits. This is a recent publication, I'm going to finish on this, which shows the dietary and other interventions that are related to usually intermediate outcomes, and some of them have been associated with lifespan. I hate the graphic they've used. I hate the graphic they've used in the context of ageism, but the facts here are absolutely correct. These dietary interventions, nutraceutical interventions, phytochemicals, physical activity, microbiome-based interventions. I haven't touched on any of those today in the short period, but they're all of benefit and things that we can do to modify environmental factors. Pharmaceuticals, metformin is now being looked at, the diabetic drug in a large trial called TAME. Rapamycin is probably the most popular at the moment amongst scientists as being of benefit. Resveratrol has lost favour, spermidine maybe, and there are a number of senolytic drugs, etc., and statins, which we know influence cellular aging. So get the bloods right, maybe take some of those supplementary factors, but remember relationships. Remember stress, remember the different components of physical activity, how attitude matters, how purpose and creativity actually can help, and also that might be an avenue for improving social engagement. The bottom line is, older age is often portrayed relentlessly negatively, when actually the experience for many is positive, and life gets better after 50 on average, quality of life. Most people enter old age and remain in good health. It is not all doom and gloom. And a great many more go through older age in health which is sufficient to have independence and a high quality of life. Most people do not get Alzheimer's disease or other dementias or major debilitating conditions before they die. And the chance of delaying disease, this is the important thing, and disability and improving quality of life are increased by the measures we've discussed. And it doesn't matter at what stage of life you introduce them. However, the earlier, the better. But they are beneficial at all stages. So thank you. I will take questions for a few minutes. I'm sorry I went a bit over, but I knew I was the last, so I could afford the luxury. Yes. There's a question here. Thank you.
So who was the first person?
Aren't these young students fantastic to be helping out so much all week?
Thank you. My name's Paul, Atherton. I'm a fellow at the Royal Society of Arts. You talked about the
That's a giveaway.
you talked about the discrepancy between people who have access to money and people who don't, and the dramatic impact that has on life expectancy. Now, I've been experiencing homelessness for 15 years now, and one of my biggest challenges is that with disability benefits, it is not sufficient to buy good quality food. Now, how do you think we can address that in our current situation? And just as an added one, I swim in the Serpentine Swimming Club, so swim in cold water all through winter, so that's kind of a benefit. It's one of those things that's cheap and expensive and something you can do very freely. But yeah, it is my biggest problem. So,
and not only that, but the stress that accrues must be huge. You know, so I wish Keir Stormer were here and he could hear me, because, and they're very well aware of this. This is an immediate problem. And I didn't show you the graphs, but that linear relationship between, you know, the last 200 years and life expectancy has started to do this since 2012 in the UK. And it's almost entirely, not exclusively, but almost entirely due to what you've just described and that level of social deprivation. It's awfully important, and actually having the knowledge that you're secure in your accommodation and your environment is a fundamental human right.
Thank you.
Yes, over here. Yeah,
thanks. Hi. You mentioned lifespan being genetically controlled in about 30% of the
20 to 30,
20 to 30%. The rest is environment. Some of that environment we can control.
Yes.
But not many people are able to exercise regularly or stick to healthy diet. So we in fact can't control it, as you implied. So do you have any comments on that?
I agree with you. We, as a society, are not optimizing all of those environmental factors which we know work. However, there are some, like social engagement, which I get strength from knowing how important that is to us as animals, biologically. And they're things that, generally speaking, shouldn't cost that much money or time. Now, I have given talks to high executives, and I've been surprised afterwards at the number who came out to say, you know, at our level, it is very lonely. And when we stop working, we actually don't have any of that infrastructure. So what I'm saying is that social isolation and loneliness is pervasive. It's across all age groups and actually doesn't necessarily map to certain socioeconomic demographics. And, you know, I mean, it's up to the individual. It's also up to society to make it easier for people to employ all of these environmental changes. I mean, how many of us brag about going in at 7 o'clock in the morning, not leaving, you know, your work until 7 o'clock in the evening, you know, wow, what a saint am I? And that actually is not a good thing. It's stressful. You're eating at your desk. You're not exercising. You're not socially engaging, probably, etc. So work environment, I think, is one way we can change it, but I think raising awareness, hopefully, will also help at a societal and an individual level. It's all men. I might ask this lady over here. That's okay.
I just wanted to quickly say, this is going to be our last question, just because of timings for the live
Can we have
stream.
just two more? This lady and that gentleman, because he had his hand up as well.
Just the answers may not come up on the live stream if you do want to look back, but...
That's okay. Doesn't matter. I can say anything then. That's okay.
Hi, thank you so much. About 30 years ago or so, 40 years ago, the human-animal companion animal bond movement got started, and studies were done of the difference that having an animal in your life and that what it does for facilitating contacts. I live near a park, and I take an early morning walk in the park before the crowds get there, but I always stop and talk to dogs. I love dogs more than anything. And why isn't there more being done to encourage and support? I mean, you've been reading all of these articles lately about how high veterinary costs are.
So that's a very good point, actually. And the only society that I know of I'm very glad the dogs haven't answered you back, because then the question would have changed totally. But the Italian Gerontological Society have actually coupled with the Italian Veterinary Society recently to enable more feasible access for people to fees, yeah, and knowing the huge benefit to health, physical and cognitive health, that a pet is. You're quite right. And again, in TILDA, we've done work to show this. Independent of other confounders, having a pet helps. We'll just ask that gentleman, sorry, is that okay? You're probably exhausted after your week.
Oh, Roseanne, let me just interject. Because it's 5, what we'll do is we'll open the doors. If anyone wants to go out, they can go out. And because there's no other talk left after this, if you've got a question, feel free to stick around.
No, we'll make this the last question.
Okay. For Roseanne's
I need
health,
a drink.
She needs a drink. We'll make it the last one.
Thanks.
Having a drink's kind of appropriate. So how do you balance, I like having a drink and eating burgers, and they make me more socially interactive. So how do you balance the good and the bad in some of those?
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, it is a balance, and it's important to get the balance right. And again, I come back to what I said earlier on. It's the strength of that social engagement. And of course, if that means, having a few drinks with people. I've got into trouble, by the way, for saying that. I'm really glad we're not online before. But that's life, and that's, a number of people drink and engage with others drinking. And burgers. No, what can I say? There's a lot of literature around ultra-processed foods, etc., so it depends on the quality of all of that. But my goodness, you have to have a happy medium and things. And that's what I would say about that. And I know miserable people who don't drink, who are vegans. Sorry if there's anybody in the audience here. But seriously, who make sacrifices at every turn, and they're not good company.